are beginning a series this morning. We are going to start through the life of Christ. And I think it's a good place to start is at the beginning, and if it happens to be that the beginning happens to be a Christmas story. So this morning launches us into a new series. As I've mentioned, I'm not planning to do every single event or every single moment in Christ's life. That would take our own lifetime to work through it all. But certainly some of the highlights and some of the high points of who Christ is and what He's done. And I think it's apropos, it's important that as believers, New Testament believers, we pause every once in a while and just look at the life of Christ. I think that's very important to us. A lot of us have these things in our minds, but us who are wanting to follow Him, we need to know what He looked like, how He behaved. We want to act like Him all the more, and it's a good exercise. So we begin at the beginning, which of course is why we're here this morning, this being what we call Christmas Sunday, traditionally, the Sunday prior to Christmas. And I'm sure we're well and truly familiar, for the most part, with the Christmas story. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that all the world should be taxed, and so Mary and Joseph went up from the town of Nazareth to the city of David, etc., to Bethlehem to be registered, and it came time for her, she was with child, and you know the story, there was no room, laid Him in a manger, were shepherds in the field, you know the drill. That is very well-known and, of course, clearly biblical story of the Nativity and what took place and all the ins and outs. But I think that there's a Christmas story that we kind of don't always spend a lot of time with. And this morning, we're going to look at the Nativity from a different perspective, if you will. We're going to call this John's Christmas story. From the passage that we read already this morning, we see that John's gospel begins entirely differently. He doesn't start with the physical semantics of exactly what took place. He starts in a place that we, perhaps in our own selves, wouldn't even think to go. He begins in a place that we wouldn't naturally even consider. Now, I've read these verses to you. I'm certainly not going to take the time to read them again. I should say you read them to me, I read them to you, we read them together. But at any rate, John's gospel begins talking about Christmas, if you will, with three words that truly just fascinate anybody who is listening, who is reading this text. Any Jewish person who picked up this text that he writes in John and began to read his gospel, to read those first three words, they would immediately be whisked away to another portion of Scripture. I don't need to tell you what that is. Those three words, of course, in the beginning. Notice it doesn't say at the beginning. He says in the beginning. And John's gospel begins by taking our imaginations not to a nativity, not to two people, not to a birth, not to a pregnancy, not to a manger, not to all the semantics of physical things. He takes us to a place before time, before space, before everything. He wants to start at the very beginning of the beginning of the beginning. That's what he means. In the absolute total beginning. Even before time, and beginning is a time word. Language begins to strain and groan under the stress of trying to express the inexpressible. And that is exactly what is going on here. We use a time word to talk about a time when there was no time. In the very absolute beginning. And if you were a Jewish person, you knew immediately what he was referencing. He is wanting us to go back all the way to the beginning of the beginning that we read about in Genesis chapter 1. And every Jewish person would pick this up and immediately be whisked back to that passage. In the beginning, God created. And how did He create? From verse 3. God said, "Let there be," and there was. In the very beginning of the beginning, the eternal, all-existent God, ever-existent God spoke. And when He spoke, His words were causative. Now, that doesn't happen for you or me. Clearly, that's why we have a Christmas list of all the 49 and a half things we want for Christmas, and we make sure that all our relatives know, because I can't speak things into existence. We have no ability to do that, or I'd be eating a cheese sandwich right now. I would just speak it into existence. But God speaks, and when He speaks, things happen. And that's the principle that John is leaning on as he begins his gospel. He takes everybody right back in the beginning of the beginning, and he uses a phrase. He says, in that very beginning, and then he borrows something from that notion of that the Jewish mind has, that words, God speaks and something happens. He uses a phrase, the Word. That's exactly what was in the beginning. God spoke and something happened. Words carry meaning. Words carry ideas. John is extremely intelligent. There are writers in the New Testament, I mean no disrespect, whose language is relatively simple. Without any disrespect intended, John Mark, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, is very low-brow Greek. It's just a very simple text. You can tell this man was not very educated. Used of God, don't misunderstand me. It's an inspired word. I'm not trying to demean it in any way, but the text itself gives away that this man is not the brightest man that's ever lived. The book of John, immediately right at the get-go, you know this guy has got some smarts about him. He is playing with words and ideas and hanging things together in such a clever, intelligent way. This is one of the most profound verses, I believe, in all of Scripture. In the beginning, taking us right back to the start, was the Word. Now, you notice that in English we put a capital W on that. That's because in the context, we have figured out what John is referring to. Because if you read down far enough into John 14, chapter 1, verse 14, it says, the Word became flesh. And that's the clue to us. And you know this already because you know the Christmas story, and this is an old hat, I'm sure. That is talking about a person who became flesh, and we know immediately that that's talking about Jesus. And so we go back now to the beginning when we translate this, and we put a capital W on that because he's referencing a person. He's not now talking about words, but he is. Words have meaning. Words have purpose. Words say something, and he's speaking to us through a person, is what John is saying. In the very beginning of the beginning was the Word. And Jesus is a message from God to us. God, as it were, is speaking to us in a person. That's the way John begins his gospel. Now, I want to just get a little technical with you this morning, if I may, just to pull some of this apart, because it is quite fascinating, in my humble opinion, which you did not ask for. It comes to you free of charge. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Now, this text in itself causes a lot of people consternation, because this text is so clear, it is so plain, it is so straightforward. It says everything you need to know about Jesus. It lays it all out plain and simple. It doesn't unfold like other Gospels, people read from the beginning and read in the middle and get to the end, and then a little light bulb starts to dim. I know who Jesus is. I've got this figured out. I see what the author's trying to say. John lays the thing out right at the start. Right as the gates open, he pushes you right into the very end of the beginning. He tells you who Jesus is. And he says, the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Now, what does that mean, to be with God? How could you be with God? Doesn't that mean that you had to exist before everything existed? If you were with God in the beginning, didn't you have to pre-exist? Yeah, you did. Did you have to be equal with God in some way? Yeah, you do. Don't you have to be an eternal being to be with God in the beginning before everything began? Yeah, that's exactly right. The Word was with God. Now that in itself would raise anybody's eyebrows. In fact, it's one of the reasons that this passage has been mistranslated so many times to try and skirt around the truth that John so plainly makes clear to us. Now this little phrase, with God, I want to park here for a minute, because I have us ask the question, what does he mean by with God? I mean, in what way is he with God? Because you and I are with each other right now in this room. Is that what he means? He's just kind of there? He's just kind of beside him in some way? What does he mean he's with God? You know, it might sound like I'm splitting hairs, and I always find it risky to get too technical, and I always think it sounds precocious to start throwing around Greek words, but we're about to do that, so you'll have to get over it. The word with in this text is what we... no, it isn't. Let me back up. I blew it. Let me back up. The word with in Greek, there are several options that John had when he was writing this text. Okay, one of them, thank you, is the word sun. Okay, it looks like sun in English. It's not pronounced sun. Doesn't really matter. But the word son, which actually has translated into our English, it means to be with something. This is not the word he used. This word with is the way that we would translate even into English, borrowing from this Greek notion. The word synonym, for example, that something is with or like, together like something else. That there's some sort of a similarity. You know what a synonym is? Two words that in themselves are distinct words, but have a commonality about them. So, for example, shut and close are synonyms. Two different words, but mean the same thing. You know, like introvert and Carrie McKelvey. Two different words, but they mean the same thing, okay? That kind of thing. Sorry, Carrie, just having fun. Weak, feeble, right? In themselves, they're different, and yet there's a similarity, a commonality. It's not the word to use. It's the same way that we would use the word synchronize. Okay, we could have all our watches on the same time. We might be in Taipei and Cairo and Massachusetts and wherever, but we might have our watches synchronized. And that way, we're together. We're with each other. You can be with your friend or your brother or your uncle at a soccer game in another place. You're rooting for them, but you're not physically with them. This is a very vague sense of with. And John could have used that sense of with, just kind of a togetherness, sort of in spirit, sort of there, but that's not what he did. In fact, this is why we have the word synagogue. That's the very idea of togetherness. We are with each other in this room. There's people on that side of the room and people on that side of the room, and we're with each other, but just in a kind of a collective sense. He didn't use that word. Clearly, that's not what he meant. Neither did he use the word para, which is also a word that means with. I trust you don't find this too tedious. I personally find this fascinating. He didn't use the word para, which means with, which in English is also a word that means with, because we have some words like, this is a strange word, but it is a word, paraclete, not parakeet. That's a completely different thing entirely. I don't know if you know the word paraclete is actually an English version of a Greek word that's parakletos. Now I'm getting so technical here. I think I'm going to try and be some sort of an egghead. It is a reference in John chapter 16. Jesus says, the Comforter will come, the parakletos, the one who will draw alongside you. He's not going to be you, but he's going to come alongside and comfort you, in reference to the Holy Spirit. We use this kind of idea when you have a heart attack and you're lying on a sidewalk and somebody calls for 911 and they have to throw your shovel to the side and get on top of your chest and do whatever they do to keep you alive. You need a paramedic, someone who will draw alongside, very close to you, will enter right into your problem, right into your situation, draw right to where you are and come to your aid. That's the idea of this word. And John could have used the word. He is paratheos. He didn't say that. He is not so close to him that he comes right in beside him. We have a word in English also that comes from this Greek idea, parallel. Something that is right along something else that runs simultaneously beside it. You know that word. That's the idea of the word. That's not the word that he used. In fact, he used the word that you would never even have guessed he would have used. This man did something that you're not even supposed to do. He didn't even use the word with. He used the word that is the word pros in Greek. This is kind of technical, but it's actually fascinating because this is so well written that I have to actually take the time to explain this to us because it's just so cool. If you don't think it's cool, you can go home and pretend it's not, but it is. Pros, he doesn't even use the word that means with. This word actually means towards. What? So his sentence actually doesn't even make sense. And the word was towards God. And that makes so little sense that we actually have to try and work out, John, what are you trying to say? Because that doesn't even mean anything. And we actually know that the word pros, although vast majority of the time it means towards something, to or towards something, you can actually use the word to mean with in a very limited sense. And it's this. This word pros, which has come to be the prefix of another Greek word. I told you this is getting so technical. Your eyes are glassing over. The word prothesis. Oh, what is the word? It's out of my head. It's a word that means face. Okay, go look it up as I can't remember it. Kevin, do you know what it is? No, it isn't profile, but that's why we get the word. See, all Greek, English, it's all together here, people. That's why we're doing this, because we actually know more Greek than you think you do, right? You just didn't realize how smart you were. That's all there is to it. The word, it came to mean face, okay? And it carried with it this idea of being with something in an extraordinarily intimate, close way. And it implies a face-to-face relationship, and we do this in English. We imply this kind of thing in English when we would say something like, the man was with his wife last night. We didn't say anything inappropriate, but we know exactly what we meant with that sentence. And we use the word with, implying a relationship that is deeper than just an ordinary relationship. That's exactly what John is doing here. He has borrowed a word that isn't even the word with, and twisted it in such a way and threw it in there to say, the Word was, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, not in some mystical kind of, they're all on the same page, kind of in the Spirit kind of way. Not some he just drew alongside and he was beside him like you're beside your husband or your wife on the pew next to you, like he's just right there. No. He is with him on some level that is intimate and deep and personal and connected. Something that he's reaching for a way to express this, because it's not just an ordinary relationship. And he says now, on top of this kind of relationship, get this, not only is he with God, but the Word was God. Now, just a cotton picking second. How can you be with something and be that something at the same time? Aren't we dealing with a bit of a contradiction here? He was with him, just like you can be with somebody else, but he was actually that thing as well. What? He was with him and he was him. Okay, John, now you're not making any sense at all. And just to clarify, so that you don't think he's gone off the rails and he's making up some nonsense and he said a mistake, he very quickly goes back. He was, that's the same word, was in the beginning with, the same word pros. He was in the beginning with God. So he's talking now, to make sure you're clear, in the very beginning, before anything, before time, before creation, this eternal, self-existent being, this God, there was the Word. And this Word had an intimate relationship with God in some way, and this intimate, personal relationship with the Word was, in fact, God. What are you saying? Are you saying now that somehow that this Word was some created thing? John very quickly underlines this. No. This Word is not a created thing. Just to clarify this, all things were made through Him. The Word was the one who spoke. That's what he's saying. At the beginning of Genesis, when we read, in the beginning was God. And God said, he is declaring that the very one who came to this earth, this Jesus, was the very one who was in the beginning in the book of Genesis, who said, let there be, and there was. This is that Word. Are you kidding me? John, how could you possibly be believing that the very God who created all the universe is the very God who came to earth? Is that what you're saying? Yes, that's what he's saying. This is jaw-dropping to Christianity. Can I just tell you this? This is not some peripheral idea, some little cute little thing that you need to remember, some little nice theological doctrinal fact that you need to hold on to. Can I just remind you, this is central to Christianity. This is exactly why we have Christmas. This is the big deal about Christmas. It has absolutely nothing, can I say politely, to do with a fat man in a red suit. You can sit your children with their soggy diapers on his knee to ask for something from this man who has absolutely nothing to do with anything. It's all about the fact that an eternal being actually chose to come here to be one of you and one of me. Now, I know this whole concept of how he could be with him and be him and come here, this is just beyond us. At the risk of trying your patience this morning, I'm going to share an illustration with you that I think is helpful personally. It's helped me, and I've shared this with some of you at the prison, I think, a while ago, so this is a repeat to some ears. What can I do? What John is doing here, if I can just remind us, he's delving onto the edges, the very edges of talking about a word that is not even found in the New Testament, but we know it exists because of verses like this. He is with God and he is God. How can those both be true? He is talking about a God who is not like you and he's not like me. And he's trying to find words which don't really exist to explain something that is inexplainable. He is trying to describe what we describe as the Trinity. Not a biblical word, but is a biblical concept. And he's talking about a God a being who is multifaceted, who we can't explain it. Let me try to explain what John is trying to do with an illustration. Imagine, if you will, that you come across in your travels, you open your closet door, you look under your bed, you happen to open the refrigerator. I can't explain why. Use your imagination here, people. This is nonsense. You find a portal to another dimension. Okay? You've read enough science fiction. You can just go with this. God's given us minds that can stretch beyond reality just enough to follow what I'm saying. I know it's silly, but just do this. And you have found a world that is two-dimensional. Only two dimensions. In case you didn't realize, we live in a world of three dimensions. Yeah? That way, that way, that way. Three dimensions. But this world is two dimensions. In other words, everything is flat. Flat as it can possibly be. Everything we know in this world is three-dimensional. But this world, the only way you can move is forward and backwards, left and right. In other words, what I'm saying, there is no such word in the vocabulary of these people of up or down. They don't know what you mean. They could never understand that concept. That concept does not exist in that realm. It is irrelevant to them. It is unknown to them. It is a world that means nothing because it is not of their dimension. It is not in the realm. Nothing in our world is two-dimensional, and that's why we have a hard time putting our heads together. You're thinking of a piece of paper, probably, and that's wrong because a piece of paper is actually three-dimensional. If you don't think so, stack 10 or 50 or 100 of them on top of each other, and you'll find out they actually have dimension. Nothing is two-dimensional in this world, so you're doing your best right now to stretch your brain to imagine that, and you can't, but go with this. There's a two-dimensional world, and you come along from a three-dimensional realm, and you say, hello, and they say, where's that voice coming from? And you say, I'm in the third dimension. What is the third dimension? I don't know what this is. And you say, I would like to educate you. And you run off to the side of your bed where, you keep these kind of things. And you bring back an object. You bring a cube, as everyone has, beside their bed. And you say, I would like to show you a three-dimensional object and show you what the third dimension looks like. Just go with me, people. This is silly, but just work with me. And you take that three-dimensional object and you bring it into that two-dimensional realm. And you do your best to explain to them that this is a three-dimensional object. And the moment you drop it into that two-dimensional realm, this person who is now a flatsy person looks at that what was a three-dimensional object, the moment it enters their realm, becomes a two-dimensional object, and they say, I know what that is. That's a square. And you say, no. It's not a square. It's a cube. And they say, what is cube? And you say, it's an object that has 6 sides. They say, I don't see 6 sides. You say, let me show you. And you pick the cube up, you flip it over, and you drop it back into the two-dimensional realm, and it immediately becomes two-dimensional. And they say, a different square. You say, no, it's not a different square. It's the same object, but a different side of the very same thing. They say, no, it's not. I see a different square. You say, no, let me show you. You pick the cube up, you flip it over again, and you do that 6 times. And you show them, and you begin to convince them in all the language you can begin to explain to people that don't know up. They don't know anything other than just flat, that this object has depth. What is depth? That's a word that you can't know in the second dimension. What do you mean there's height? There's no such thing as height. What are you talking about? And you begin to find language that they know to try and explain something that doesn't exist in their realm to get them to believe, get this, by faith, they would have to believe you that all 6 squares are actually one object. Because where they are, what you possess cannot and does not exist. Now, my point in that ramble is just to make the point that that's exactly what John is trying to do. God, who is well beyond our three dimensions, who exists in an infinite number of dimensions, is a being where he exists, the physics allow one being to be three persons that we can't understand or grasp because the language is beyond three dimensions, and God now is trying to explain to us something that is inexplainable to us, and the language begins to groan and squeak under the weight of the whole thing. That in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Him, and the Word was Him, and He was in the beginning with Him. What are you saying? He is saying that this one being has three persons to Him, and one of those persons has come here. And He's the very same being. Now, my head hurts because I don't get it. You don't get it. But that is what we're talking about, what John is trying to grasp at to get us to understand. Then he goes on in verse 4. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness. It's a theme that he picks up throughout the book of John. Light, darkness. You'll see that through the book of John if you read it. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, I want to just pause for a second on this word overcome. I learned this week, this is an interesting word in part of my studies, that I want to just pause that for a minute. I don't know if you've seen it in a translation, that some translations take this word a little bit differently, depending on what version you have. And the word overcome, again, I know it's so precocious to get technical, the word is katalambano, and it means to take or to receive or to seize on something in a pouncing kind of eagerly way, to overcome something, or in some versions, to conquer something, right? But interestingly enough, it also comes to mean to lay hold of, not only in a physical sense of overcoming something, but we do the very same thing in English, meaning to lay hold of something on an intellectual level. Do you know when you're in grade 5 and you come for the first time to long division and you have no idea what the teacher's talking about, and the teacher explains it again and you still don't get it, and you explain that you put up your hand and the teacher says, well, you have the number 4, and how many times can 4 go into 16? I don't know. I see a 1 and a 6. I don't see any 4s. I don't get it. So you just say that, I don't get it. What do you mean you don't get it? Get it is a word that you say on Christmas morning. When you say, I get socks for Christmas. What kind of a mother gives you socks for Christmas? You poor child. You say, I get a new pair of shoes. I get a bicycle. You talk about get in that way. What do you mean you don't get it? You mean you don't understand it. You don't comprehend it in an intellectual way. You don't get the concept. That is exactly what this word is. It is a word that on the one hand means to seize something physically, and on the other hand it also means to seize something intellectually, to understand it. And that is why this word has got this double meaning. When it comes to English, we actually have translated it two different ways. Some versions, like the ESV, says has not overcome it. NASB and King James has translated this, did not comprehend it. Both are actually exactly right. Because the word means both things. Because that is exactly what has happened with what we've got at the incarnation. We have God Himself, who has come in the person of Jesus, the very God who created the entire universe, who is with God in an intimate sense, and is very God Himself, that God who broke through the infinite number of dimensions that He exists in, to come into the third dimension, to express Himself in some way that we can barely understand what's going on. And John very clearly explains, this is God, a very God. This is no mistaking who He is. And what happens to us? I don't get it. I don't understand what you mean. So what do we come up with for Christmas? Elves and trees and sleighs and bells and candles, and we talk about Christmas miracles because little Timmy's family couldn't afford a bike and he got a bike. It's a Christmas miracle. We bent the whole thing and twisted the whole, and we don't even know what we're talking about anymore. We do not comprehend, as a human race, We do not understand what God has done. We do not understand what he has spoken to us. And it has never been overcome. And also in the sense that it's never been conquered. Christmas will continue to exist. The incarnation will continue to marvel people. People's hearts will continue to bow to the Christ who is Lord of all. They will continue. It will never, in spite of all the darkness, all the world that hates Christ, all the world that wants nothing to do with Christmas, all the world that poo-poos the whole thing as just religious nonsense, and all the intelligent people who don't believe in God know that the whole thing is crazy. Goodness sakes, those poor Christian people who believe this nonsense about God becoming a man, they will never be overcome because God himself has spoken to us. And this is Christmas. Can we pray?